Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are an international organisation. We're a UK-based certified social enterprise, but I'm pleased to say that people in 21 countries get our weekly newsletter, The Transparency Times. If you don't already know, we're all about the idea of reforming the financial sector so that it serves society better. Our guiding principles are ideas such as sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we've been running since 2015. Much of our work these days is focused on the many shortcomings that we see in the workings of the regulatory and governance framework around the financial industry. Organisations such as the Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Ombudsman Service, the National Crime Agency, Action Fraud, etc., 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 are all of great interest to us. And what we generally believe is that these organisations are not functioning as they once did in terms of being loyal to true consumer interests. We believe that issues such as the revolving door problem, issues such as conflicts of interest, issues such as self-interest have led these organisations to disappoint the consumer. Perhaps the most egregious example of this kind of thing is what we've all been learning about regarding the post office scandal. Of course, it's been right up there in the news coverage all year long. That wonderful ITV documentary, Alan Bates versus the Post Office, has really helped people understand how once trusted institutions can behave very, very poorly and causing great harm. Many of the people in our community are individuals who have suffered as a direct consequence of the kind of institutional failure that I'm talking about. And sometimes we find ourselves looking into the abyss in terms of whether there might be some kind of corruption going on. Corruption is a big word, isn't it? It's a very, very powerful word. It's a very, very emotive word. It's a word that conjures up all kinds of images. Is it, cash in brown envelopes, or is it something a little bit more sinister and perhaps even more sophisticated than that? Corruption is the kind of thing that many people know a little bit about, but very few people properly understand. And that's why we are, remarkably fortunate to have with us two of the country's leading experts in this space, the authors of a dictionary on corruption, Professor Liz David Barrett and Robert Barrington, with us today. They're going to be talking about their book. Of course, that makes complete sense because they would have put their hearts and souls into their book and used it as a vehicle to transmit the thoughts and ideas and insights and experiences that they've got. We'll also, of course, be talking about the wider issues as well. What are the trends? Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are the enforcement agencies doing what they could and should be doing? Is there a general lack of sunlight in so many places that's causing opacity to get in the way of truth and justice? And what can be done about the problems? Who's to blame, etc., etc. We will make it as participative as we can. Let's try to create this kind of conversation amongst adults dynamic that we so often are able to do within Transparency Task Force meetings. But can I please, first of all, before I ask our speakers to get the ball rolling, can I please invite everybody to, first of all, show their appreciation to Elizabeth and Robert for spending time preparing and presenting today's session. Can I please invite you to show your appreciation? You're very, very much amongst friends here, Elizabeth and Robert, and I hope you enjoy this session as much as I'm sure we are going to as well, okay? We'd love to know a bit about yourselves and your background. We'd love to know what kind of got you interested in this space in the first place. And of course, what, if you can remember, if there isn't quite precise, what was it that actually initiated the conception of the book itself? Tell us what you'd like to tell us. Can I invite Elizabeth to go first of all? But Elizabeth, if you don't mind, first of all, just tell us a bit about yourself, and I'll then ask Robert to introduce himself properly, and then we can talk about the beginnings of your book too. Thank you. Elizabeth, over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Andy, for that great introduction, and thanks everybody for being here on a nice spring evening. It's really great to see such good turnout, and look forward to the discussion. So my name's Liz. Do call me Liz rather than Elizabeth. I'm a professor at Sussex, and I'm also the director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption at Sussex, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment in my slides. In terms of how I got interested in the topic, I was actually a journalist in the late 90s and early 2000s, working in the Balkans for The Economist and the FT. And it was really while I was in Croatia that I got very interested in corruption. And of course, this was late 90s. It was after the War of Independence in Croatia, and after some of the Bosnian War too, and the collapse of Yugoslavia. There were still other wars to come, sadly, in the region. But at the time I was there, it was a period of some optimism in Croatia. The war was over, but there was a nationalist president in charge, Franjo Tudjman. And under Tudjman, what had been happening was a series of corruption scandals, which were very similar to what we also saw happening in Russia in terms of oligarchs getting very easy access to state assets as they were being privatized. So a lot of what I was covering there was in fact around this emerging corruption story at the time. At the end of 1999, Tudjman died. There was then a sort of opening up period in Croatia. And after a couple of years of covering that story, I decided that I really wanted to get more interested, more involved in studying corruption rather than being a journalist. And so I then came back to the UK and did my DPhil at Oxford on political corruption in the transition period. So that was the beginning for me. And then over the years, I've worked on various different aspects of corruption, around corruption in business and business integrity, particularly corruption in public procurement, but also issues around standards in public life, particularly conduct of MPs and codes of conduct and those kinds of issues. So covered quite a lot of different issues. And my current area of interest is really a quite high level and systematic form of corruption that is known as state capture. And that's distinguished from administrative corruption in that it occurs in the actual formation of policy. So in when laws are being shaped, institutions are being shaped, the constitution is being changed. So it's about changing the rules of the game so that everyone then operates under those laws and rules that privilege a certain group, as opposed to just corruption that occurs in the implementation phase, which might subvert the implementation of a policy, but doesn't change the rules of the game forevermore. So I'll stop there.
That's already been so interesting. The phrase state capture is, as I've just mentioned in the chat, of enormous interest to TTF. Roger Mullin, former MP, was with us tonight. Was the key speaker at an event we ran, I think about a year ago, roughly, on that very theme of state capture, which we kind of understood to be, my kind of informal definition of it would be the widespread failure of institutions to preserve the integrity of the system, that kind of thing. And in all honesty, and without being dramatic about it, we're seeing evidence of that kind of experience all over the place. And it's really worrying, really is worrying. So great that you've mentioned that already, Liz. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody in the audience is thinking, I'm so glad I'm here because everything you're going to be talking about will be of real interest to the folks we have here tonight. Thanks, Liz. Robert, what would you like to say in terms of your background and the initial thoughts about the book and so on? Thank you, Robert.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. It's really great to be talking about the dictionary. I'm also a professor at the University of Sussex alongside Liz, and I'm a professor of anti-corruption practice, which means that I'm from a background as a practitioner, somebody who's worked on the issue of corruption outside academia, At the very start of my career, I was an academic. I did a PhD in Renaissance Venice, and then a small amount of teaching at Oxford. But I rapidly concluded that I wanted to look at the wider world, and I worked for an environmental NGO, a sort of environmental development NGO. And at that point, this was in the 1990s, it was beginning to feel to me as though whatever other issues you looked at in the world, unless you were going to do something about corruption, you were pretty much onto a loser, whether you were looking at overseas development or human rights or environmental issues and so on. And I sort of parked that thought and then went to work in the city for a few years. Within my portfolio of companies were jewels in the crown of British industry, like BAE Systems and British American Tobacco. And increasingly, I came across the issue of corruption playing out in real time with many of those companies. And at that time, we didn't have a bribery act in the UK, and it was very hard to prosecute big companies, as we saw with the BAE Systems case. So then, having been in the city, and I always felt I was working a bit undercover in the city because I knew I was there for the ignoble reason of earning enough money to buy a house, and then I was going to leave, and that I did. And then I went to work for a non-governmental organization called Transparency International, which is a global organization that just works on the issue of corruption. And I ran the UK bit of it for about a dozen years, and then came to Sussex. So I had that sort of germ of a feeling in the 1990s that, you know, corruption was stopping us doing things that decent people in the world wanted to get done. And that really increased as I was in the city. And then coming to Transparency International, I became a campaigner about it. One of the big campaigns was to get the Bribery Act in the UK. And then subsequently, now back in Sussex, I've been doing some more academic analysis of it, which is fascinating. Coming in as a practitioner, you realize that there's a bit of a gulf between loads of study that goes on in the academic sphere on corruption and what practitioners are thinking and talking about. So in a way, the dictionary is trying to help bridge that gap by being a user-friendly guide for ordinary people as to what this whole landscape of corruption is and looks like and what it means and how you refer that back to the academic research on corruption. And just finally, I'm now working on a book on corruption in the UK called Corrupted Kingdom, which is due to come out in 2026.
Oh, this is fantastic. We're on a roll already. We really are. There are so many things you've mentioned, Liz and Robert, that are of enormous interest to us. Later on, I'll try to help you understand the sorts of situations that make what we're talking about so front of mind interesting to us. But let's turn attention to your book. And Liz, I think you've got some slides there, haven't you? You want to share? Would you like to get them on the screen now?
That's right, I have.
Okay.
Let's see. Is that working?
Perfectly well. Yes, we've done this before, haven't we?
Absolutely. So our title is From Amu Kudari to Watergate. So our kind of A to Z, or at least A to W of corruption. And we're going to be talking about this book here. I'm just going to do this. I've already, I think, outperformed Liz Truss by being able to show this the right way up.
That's right.
First time. But I'm going to tell you a little bit, first of all, about the Centre for the Study of Corruption. So we were established in 2012 by my colleague, Professor Dan Huff, as the UK's first academic centre on corruption. We're still the only dedicated corruption research centre in the UK. There are a few globally, but it's a fairly small field, and we've been able to collect quite a lot of expertise in Sussex for the aims of the centre, which are around teaching, research and policy impact. You've already heard a lot about who we are, so I won't go into any more detail about myself or Robert, but just to say that we're quite representative in a way of the centre, in that very much what we're trying to do is to combine academia and practice, to bridge academia and practice, And that can be seen, for example, in a very big project that we've recently taken on, which is funded by the Foreign Office, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and that's called the Governance and Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme. And it's all about trying to generate academic evidence for what works in terms of anti-corruption. So our focus is on these three areas. In terms of research, we're trying to undertake rigorous academic research, all peer-reviewed, to address the world's major corruption issues. We've got expertise on lots of different areas of corruption and also anti-corruption policies. So whether it's business or sport or political corruption, we've got people working on all of the key areas, I would say. In terms of courses and teaching, we have 2 master's programs. We've got a full-time or part-time program that's on campus, but we've also got an online master's in corruption and governance, which quite fortuitously we had just launched around about the time of the first lockdown. So it's also possible for people to study the masters while they're working alongside professional lives through that online program. And we really see that we're sort of training the next generation of anti-corruption professionals there. A lot of our people who've been through the master's programs, many of them came in with some corruption experience and were doing it partway through their career. But we've also seen them now go out and filter through into anti-corruption practice. So in fact, there is quite a Sussex network of people there who've been through our master's programs and who are now working in anti-corruption, whether in government or business or the NGO sector. We've also got some shorter courses, continuing professional development courses, so where we can do one day or tailored courses for particular groups of people. And then thirdly, it's really important to us that we also impact policy. So we are interested in corruption as an academic topic, but very much, of course, always thinking about actually making a difference. And so we do want to make sure that the research findings get out there, that they inform policy, and ultimately help to change the world. A final thing I wanted to say before getting into the dictionary is that we've also got a podcast. It's called Kickback, the Global Anti-Corruption Podcast. It was actually set up by some colleagues at Harvard a few years ago, and we took it over from them almost 2 years ago now. And so every 2 weeks we have an episode come out. It's an interview with either an academic or a practitioner, or sometimes a more thematic piece, which has a couple of different speakers getting into a particular topic. We've also got a page where we've organised all of the past episodes according to categories, so it can be used as a bit more of a reference library in terms of going in and being able to find out about a particular topic from all the people that have been interviewed on the podcast over the years. So I can also share a link to that after the session. But today we're here to talk about the dictionary of corruption. I think the first question we often get is, well, why do a dictionary of corruption? Do we really need one? And it was our thinking that, in fact, this is a field that has really mushroomed and become much more sophisticated over about the last 30 years. So it's 30 years since Transparency International started producing the Corruption Perceptions Index, which comes out every year with a score for how countries are perceived, how corrupt they're perceived to be in terms of public sector corruption. That and a speech from the World Bank president at the time were key events really in the history of corruption studies and anti-corruption practice, and that they really started to draw attention to the issue and get a lot more people sort of working on it. But in that 30 years, it's a field that has really become quite complex. And we found that although there's this big community of practitioners, they're also becoming more specialized. So individuals potentially know a lot about a particular aspect of corruption or anti-corruption practice, but they don't necessarily know about the whole field. And so there's a need for something which is both specialist but also introductory. The entries in the dictionary range from 50 words to 1,000. So essentially those 1,000 word ones are where we thought it's a really critical concept, something like political corruption, potentially. So it needs quite a lot of discussion and explanation. But we've also got very short definitions of new terms and jargon that might have entered the field more recently. Every single entry, though, starts with a one-sentence definition. So the idea is that it can always be used as a very quick reference if you just want to have a quick go-to about what is this without getting into further detail. The dictionary seeks to cover the key concepts. In each entry, we try to talk about what's contentious, or at least in the longer ones where we've got space to do that. Also about how the meaning might have changed over the years. And we've also got lots of important cases in there. So we noticed that in our teaching, we were often referring to important cases of corruption that had come up over the years. And we thought it's useful to have a reference point on those where you can look up and see, well, what actually did happen there? That also builds on our previous book, which is called Understanding Corruption, which is a whole set of case studies organised around 4 different sub-themes. There is a focus on corruption for all definitions. Now, that might sound obvious, but if you take something like the World Bank, for example, it's just to say that we don't go into all of the things that the World Bank does. We look specifically at what the World Bank does with respect to corruption. And our aims in doing it were partly to, as well as sort of elaborating on the field, to try to build consensus, but also to allow debate on some of the basics. So we acknowledge that these definitions are not perfect. They're one of the problems with trying to come up with a definitive definition is that these concepts are often hotly debated. They are complex. It's not straightforward. So we're not claiming that this is definitive, but we do hope that by putting these definitions out there, we will help to spark the debate and potentially build consensus on what are the key aspects. But we found that the dictionary is being used in quite a lot of different ways. We've got our master's students who are coming in and consulting it every week when they've got a different topic that they're looking at. We recently heard from one of our former students who's now working in the government's public sector fraud unit, that she uses it as a go-to whenever a new topic comes on the agenda. She uses it as a starting point for discussion with colleagues and for thinking about how they're going to react to that. You might wonder how we went about writing it. So it's not all written by the 4 editors. It's very much a collaborative effort with contributors drawn from this wide community of scholars and practitioners who are working on corruption. Their initials are after each entry, so you can then track back to who wrote it to the list of authors at the beginning. Our idea was that we wanted to have the very key thinkers in the field contribute, but also we didn't then have a very strict editing process in terms of trying to standardize to a high degree. So we wanted to allow some different voices to be heard. There is some variation in style. But all of the entries have been reviewed by at least 3 editors from the 4 members of the editorial team. Where there was something that was a really difficult or controversial entry, we had an editorial meeting where we battered it around and tried to work out what the common areas were. And if you want to hear more about those, we can certainly tell you about some of the controversies in the Q&A. It's certainly incomplete. I think since publishing it, We every week think of something that should have been in there that's not. If you've got suggestions on that, please do send them in. We hope that at one point there might be either a second edition or in fact an online open access edition. So it is something that we would want to keep building on. And as I said before, it's almost certainly imperfect as well. So what I wanted to do is just focus in on a couple of definitions. And it seemed that the obvious one to start with, of course, is the definition of corruption. And this is something that we've worked on a lot in the centre, particularly led by a colleague of ours, Rebecca Dobson-Phillips. And she's come up with what we're calling the corruption pyramid. And essentially what we've done here is we've taken a definition of corruption that is commonly used, coming from originally from academic Joseph Nye, but also used by Transparency International. And then we've slightly adapted it to add in some other aspects, and also to provide some guidance on how to use it if you're faced with an actual situation. So when you come across something that you think is scandalous or unethical, the question might be, but is it actually corruption? And the idea of this definition is that it would help you to decide on that. So our definition is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that harms the public interest and typically breaches laws, regulations, and/or integrity standards. So that will be probably fairly familiar, most aspects of that. What we've added in is the harm to the public interest. We've also, though, suggested that each of these four elements here, entrusted power, abuse, private gain, and public interest, can be seen in terms of a kind of a spectrum. And we have also suggested that we should use this definition in a sequential way. So start at the bottom and work up. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, with the spectrum, when we're thinking about entrusted power, that could be in a public office role, but we like to think that it's also potentially broader and might include other forms of entrusted power which are not necessarily defined as public office. So certainly might involve someone in a private sector role and different relations and positions in which we might entrust power so that it's exercised on our behalf. In terms of the abuse of that entrusted power, then, of course, there's immediately a judgment to be made there about what constitutes an abuse of entrusted power. Some people would say that this is only what is illegal activity. We would say that usually corruption is used in a broader way than that. So there could be acts that we would consider as corrupt, even though they're not necessarily defined as illegal or in particular as something that is illegal in terms of corruption itself. The third aspect is the private gain. This could be a very personal gain, money that is going into someone's pocket or bank account. It could be a more partisan gain, so a gain that goes to a narrow interest group. That could be a political party. It could be an interest group of some other type. So the word partisan there doesn't necessarily relate to a political party, but it relates to the idea of, rather than this being in the public interest or to a broader community, it's a very narrow gain. And then finally, public interest. This could be a very direct harm that is caused by the corruption, but it could also be more indirect in that just by undermining the rules of the game, undermining the rule of law, that is in itself causing an indirect harm to society. So that's thinking about the spectrum of each different aspect. And then sequentially, we would suggest starting at the bottom. So first of all, if you're confronted with a scandal, thinking to yourself, is there entrusted power here? Has that been abused? Did someone or some narrow interest group make a private gain from that? And has there been harm to the public interest? And if all four of those conditions are fulfilled, then we would say that is corruption. I just wanted to contrast this with fraud. So the definition of fraud that we have in the dictionary is that it's activity involving deception or dishonesty with the intention of acquiring a material gain, and in doing so, incurring losses to another party. So there are a couple of differences with corruption there. It usually involves two identifiable parties, one of whom benefits and the other who is harmed or incurs a loss. Corruption will often involve three parties, in fact. So someone who's abusing their entrusted power, someone who is perhaps inciting them to do that, and then the loss to the broader public. And fraud is usually illegal and is usually more easily defined in law. So fraud will become a form of corruption probably when it also involves an abuse of entrusted power alongside the deception. Some other entries to look out for. We've got lots of concepts in there. So things like transnational corruption, kleptocracy, state capture. Great to hear that you've already been thinking about that. You've mentioned also the revolving door. Sometimes, concepts around shell companies, beneficial ownership transparency, asset recovery, lots of different concepts in there. We've got lots of organizations, so I've put up a host of acronyms here. They're all in the dictionary and are all defined. There are lots of laws and treaties. All of these ones are in there and lots more. And of course, there are lots of cases too, which we think are really typical and interesting of different aspects of corruption. So we're going to open up to questions, but I just wanted to leave you with this, that if you are interested in buying the book, I think it's $19.99 on the Agenda Publishers website, and there should be a discount. I think it's 30% if you order with this code CONF. And apologies, I think I might have told Alexandra before that it was CONF 30. I then tried that myself and found that it didn't work, but I think CONF should work. So I'll finish there.
Liz, in all honesty, that's been one of the richest, most fruitful introductions we've ever had to a book. In all honesty, that's just been ticking boxes all the way throughout your commentary there. What you're doing is so relevant to the efforts of our community to try to shine a big bright light on stuff that's been going on. I promise you, it really is. It really is. I think if you guys knew what we've discovered about the failure of the institutions to protect consumers from harm in the financial services space, and even worse, the failure of the regulators to do their job and how they've been contaminated with this kind of conflict of interest dynamic, I think you'd be shocked. I think you'd be shocked. It's seriously depressing. And that's why what you're saying to us is, I think, of immense importance, and very, very grateful that you're both here. Thank you, Liz. Robert, do you want to add anything to what Liz has said before we kind of turn this into a conversation amongst grown-ups over the kitchen table, so to speak? Robert, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think we should just go straight to the grown-ups, probably. Okay.
There are a few here. Before we do anything, I know we kind of applauded you being here. I think everybody's going to want to do what I want to do right now, which is to literally applaud again, because that really has been a truly, truly, truly insightful session. You're helping me to kind of frame what we've witnessed and what we've seen in a robust academic context, and there's almost a kind of a validation of what we've been witnessing, hearing you talk, Liz. It's been great. I've got so many questions. I could hog you all to myself, both of you. Before we go to Robert Delmer, who I'm very pleased to see is with us tonight, I want to draw attention to Joan Finch. And Joan's probably thinking, what the hell is Andy going to say now? It was Joan Finch who found something, or heard something, or read something that led us to know about you, Liz and Robert, and your book. And while we're in the mood for rounds of applause, can we please thank Joan Finch? Because if it hadn't been for Joan doing what she did, and finding what she found and passing it over to me, we would not all be here tonight having this lovely, rich conversation. So well done, gentlemen. Thank you so, so much. Mr. Robert Delner, thank you for being here, Robert. Please, you certainly qualify as a grown-up. Please share with us your thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and just about maybe possibly a grown-up. This is more of a comment, but also a question. I bought your book. I haven't read it yet, obviously. It's on its way. But I'm particularly interested in what one can call sort of corruption of the mind or corruption of our culture. And it's becoming somewhat endemic, is the feeling, at least here in the UK. And we know, of course, the post office scandal, which is now unraveling, and there are some very, legal ramifications around that. But if we take another situation, which was around the acquisition or the procurement around PPE in the UK in the recent pandemic, I was talking to a procurement officer from another government, one of the Nordic countries, a little while ago, and the comment was what happened in the UK would have been corruption or be seen as corruption within their legal system. What is it that you think is going on in the UK in particular, which has maybe sort of infiltrated this corruption of the culture, where something like a diversion of the normal procurement processes, which normally would have happened under the NHS, could have happened so easily? And of course, millions of pounds was made by individuals, Baroness Mohn being maybe the most commonly known one. And essentially, or seemingly, we have a process, we will see what happens with that process, but it has almost become normalized within our culture and in our economy that these things can happen. I'm just curious what your thoughts are as to will this continue? Are we on a slippery slope, or will this somehow come to a happy ending somewhere? Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Great set of questions there. I'll have a go and then hand over to Robert. So on the issue of PPE procurement, on the face of it, there is a reason for using different kinds of procedures. So, the standard norm with public procurement is that it should be open and competitive. Public procurement is regulated quite a lot all around the world. It's regulated in a very similar way, at least on paper. And the principle there is openness and competition is going to get you the best value for money and the best quality, etc. Now, almost all public procurement laws have also got exceptions to that. And a key reason for an exception would be that there is some kind of emergency, that something's got to be done very quickly. Now, in theory, then, something like a pandemic is your classic example of an emergency, and it gives you a reason or an excuse to throw some of the normal rules out of the window. However, it's also very true to say that my sense is that it was used as an excuse. It's not absolutely necessary to throw all of the rules out of the window. It's not necessary to stop having open and transparent procurement, to tell people what you're spending the money on and how you've made the decisions. In fact, we saw huge variation around the world in terms of how much transparency was sacrificed during the pandemic. So some countries still kept everything extremely open. I wrote a blog at the time with Gavin Heyman, who's the head of an organisation called the Open Contracting Partnership. And we looked at a number of different country cases where, in fact, they had managed to keep things open, keep things competitive. So it wasn't absolutely essential to do it that way, and it seemed to me more that it was being used as a cover for something else rather than it actually being the legitimate reason. We also saw in the UK something that's quite extraordinary, which was the VIP channel. There's really absolutely no reason for that. So the whole idea of creating a specialist channel in which we know that the companies that went into that channel were 10 times more likely to win contracts than companies that were outside it. And getting into that channel, I mean, it's still extremely opaque, but it seems to have been something akin to having a drink in the pub with Michael Gove or something similar. So, the idea that MPs could recommend companies into that channel, I think, is quite absurd. Why would MPs have any sense of whether this is a particularly good or reputable company for this job? So if you're going to have some way of narrowing the field, then you at least need to have some criteria and system around who's going to be able to get into that narrower field. So the VIP channel, I think, was a particularly bizarre thing, and the fact that it was so formalized is also odd. It was formalized as if it were a legitimate thing to do, when it's absolutely not a legitimate thing to do. It's a very odd thing to do. We then saw, of course, huge abuses in some particular cases. The Michel Mone one is, I think, the most obvious and clear cut. But many cases actually where what was provided by a company which had no experience, no track record, really no reason to think that it was going to be good quality. And of course, this caused huge harms. So the public interest was definitely in this case compromised or damaged, because we saw that people were not getting appropriate equipment, and that was leading to deaths and a much worse pandemic situation than it needed to be. So, I mean, I'll just finish by saying that there are good reasons in an emergency. There will be things that go wrong. You can't expect things to be perfect. But there was no real reason for the lack of transparency and for the favouritism that you saw in the UK.
Thank you. That kind of great question, Robert, by the way. Thank you. That kind of exploitative, opportunistic, almost predatory nature, it seems to be a theme that's coming up more and more and more. Thanks, Lee. Thank you very much. And thanks for the question. We go to Roger next. I put in the chat, by the way.
Actually, Andy, I wonder if I could come in and add something.
Please do. Thank you, of course.
So, I mean, I'm really intrigued by this, the sort of origin of that, or starting point of that question, which is the corruption of the mind. And it sparks a few thoughts for me. The first is that I'm always really wary of attaching the label of corruption to things unless it's been thoroughly kind of stress tested, which is in a way why we've come up with that definition and the 4-step process to determine whether something is or isn't corrupt. And that works really well in cases of what we describe as transactional corruption. So where there is a transaction or series of transactions, like the Michel Mone PPE example, you can see there's entrusted power, there's abuse, there's private gain, and there's a harm to the public interest.
Yeah.
It doesn't always capture the situation where you have what is described as institutional corruption or systemic corruption. And I think that's maybe what that, by the way, both of those terms are covered in the dictionary if you want to look at them in more detail. So where you have something sort of a bit more fundamental that isn't simply transactional, that might be going towards that concept of the corruption of the mind, some kind of sort of, is there some underlying principle that is corrupt here? So are institutions that were set up for a particular purpose not only failing to do that purpose efficiently or effectively, but actually have they been diverted to other purposes? Yeah. So when we, for example, saw the attempts by the Conservative government, particularly the Johnson government, to subvert the public appointments process and sort of place people in agencies like Ofcom, that I think was an example of where you see potential diversion of purpose of an institution. That term institutional corruption has been applied a lot by US legal scholars in particular to Congress in the States, and they postulate the idea that actually Congress doesn't serve the people anymore. It serves a very narrow interest group, particularly of lobbyists on behalf of certain small interest groups. And just a couple of other things to add. The first is I wouldn't be so confident actually that the Nordics would have picked up the PPE COVID stuff immediately and really acted on it. And I think one of the difficulties with corruption is that because it's done secretly and it's often complicated and often employs lots of financial secrecy mechanisms around it as well, then it can take years to uncover. It's very easy to apply a label of corruption. You know, all the PPE procurement was corrupt, we could easily say, but it probably wasn't. You know, there were, well, it almost certainly wasn't. Some of it was, some of it wasn't. It will take years to tease out which was and which wasn't. And that's very unsatisfactory from society's point of view, because you have these, you know, massive scandals that go on, and it's only maybe 10 years later, as we saw, for example, in the BAE Systems case, 10, sometimes 20 years later, that you get enough evidence in the public domain or evidence to law enforcement authorities that action can really be taken. So finally, that brings me to the post office scandal, which has been mentioned a couple of times. Mm. We've had quite an interesting debate in our faculty about whether the original action by the post office of prosecuting the sub-postmasters was itself corrupt or not. And I think our broad conclusion is that that was, you know, mistaken and done badly, but it probably wasn't corrupt. But what was corrupt was the cover-up, which followed very shortly afterwards, because there you see an abuse of entrusted power. And I think the more I look in researching my book on Corrupted Kingdom about this issue of corruption in the UK, I see that you do get quite a lot of instances where you have an institution doing something badly, and it then becomes corruption very shortly afterwards in the cover-up. So I think you know, that seems to be a sort of part of a British feature of corruption.
Well, Robert, when is Corrupted Kingdom likely to be published?
Spring 2026, so a couple of years' time.
We'd love to have you back for that. We really would. We'd love to have you back for that. Thank you, Robert. So interesting. We'll go to Roger Mullen next. I put in the chat, folks, a link to a tweet TTF put out a couple of weeks ago about Roger's success in changing the law in Scotland. Please do have a look at it. It's in the chat, and please do share it. It's been seen by many people already, and quite rightly so. Roger, to you, sir. Please share your thought. Thank you, Roger.
Hi. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you in particular to Liz and Robert. This has been fascinating. I want to query, however, your definition. I noticed, if I remember correctly, in it, part of it said that it involves typically breaches of the law, but it says nothing about abuse of the law. So don't you accept that as well as breaching the law, there are occasions, slaps is only one example, there are many others, where the law is deliberately used by the corrupt to oppress others and to secure gain for themselves. So why haven't you added abuse of the law as well as typically breaches the law?
Wow.
That's a great question. I think we would say that we would think that that's covered by the abuse of entrusted power. So we would put that on the power holder. And then what is abused is, in a sense, is that entrusted power, essentially. And the bit there that we've got about how it would typically violate norms is, in a sense, less central to the definition. So you'll see that that wasn't one of the four component parts. But that's just in a way, actually, we put that in there to say that we need some flexibility there around whether there is a breach of the law or not, because sometimes there will be and sometimes there won't be. And important cases where there won't be are where the laws have themselves been manipulated, which would be a classic case of state capture. So actually that clause is there really to stop us being constrained by the idea that there needs to be a breach of the law. So that's one aspect of why that's there. But I think that I would probably think that abuse of entrusted power would cover off instances of abuse of the law for other purposes. What that does very much relate to is the concept of weaponized corruption, which we do also have as an entry in the book. And of course, something that we see with quite a lot of anti-corruption instruments and tools, that they will be weaponized for political purposes and for corrupt purposes. And of course, yeah, what we see with slaps is a classic example of that. And very, very pleased to see your success in Scotland there. I'll hand over to Robert, who will, I'm sure, have more to say on this.
Thank you. Well, I mean, a couple of things. The first is that the definition talks about typically breaching laws, regulations, and/or integrity standards. So it may be that one might look at abuse in terms of the integrity standards as well. But actually, I thought I'd take advantage of Roger being here to read out our definition of slaps and see if he agrees. The headline definition. So as Liz said, for each of the entries is a sort of 2 or 3 line summary, and then there's quite a few hundred words elaborating. But the headline definition on slap suits is the process whereby a person or body pursues typically unmeritorious litigation or legal threats to discourage another person or body from following a course of action, reporting on something, or expressing a view on a certain matter. You don't have to comment now, but in due course, I'd be really keen to hear your view on that.
No, I'm quite happy to comment. I would agree with everything that you have said, Robert. I would just want a little time to think if it's comprehensive enough. But I mean, I agree with what you said.
Great.
I love that word, unmeritorious. Before we go to Nigel and Stephen, I want to take a moment to try to help Liz and Robert fully understand why what you are talking about tonight is of such interest to us. And I'm going to do that by making reference to yet another book. We've talked about so many books today. The book is called Rigged, and it's written by Andy Verity, the BBC's economics correspondent. This book has been a bit of a groundbreaker for us because, well, Andy Verity, being the BBC's economics correspondent, is obviously a very, very, very credible man. And the book has been so well researched, it's completely evidence-based. And I'll just read out a couple of reference to the book to help you understand how the kind of institutional corruption and weaponized corruption and dastardly conduct has harmed people in the space that we're interested in, i.e. financial services. And what makes this so powerful a book is the corruption we're talking about, and that's the only way of describing it truly. The corruption we're talking about led people, innocent people, to be sent to jail. And but there are people on this session tonight who were with me at the meeting we had in Parliament about 9 months ago, where a whole room full of people were virtually in tears or on the edge of breaking into tears, listening to innocent traders who became scapegoats, who ended up not only losing their jobs, but also their liberty, and literally being sent to jail for many years, when in actual fact, the people who should have been properly investigated and prosecuted were high up the tree. Allow me just to read a couple of bits out here. There's a comment here from John McDonnell MP. It says, I'm reading it verbatim here, a truly shocking story of collusion, conspiracy, and cover-up at the heart of our financial establishment that has led to grave miscarriages of justice. The book surely provides the basis for a renewed parliamentary inquiry. Another one here by Victoria Derbyshire. Many of you will know the name Victoria Derbyshire. She says, a brilliant and compelling account of a huge establishment cover-up. The stories of low-level traders who found themselves expendable are brutal and heartrending. And what I'm trying to say here, Liz and Robert, is that the Transparency Task Force community has come across literally dozens of situations where there has been something that adds up to collusion, conspiracy, cover-up, corruption that has really harmed people. People have ended up taking their lives. People who've lost their lives savings, people whose lives have been wrecked, people who have suffered so much because they've been in some way expendable commodities in the pursuit of other people's gains. And I honestly say this to you to be true. This is really why what you're talking about tonight is of such interest to us. We're going to go to Nigel Kent, then to Stephen Barker. Nigel, to you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, hello, and thank you very much, speakers. It's really, really good to hear what you've got to say. And as Andy says, so relevant to subject matters that we're really interested in. One of the organisations that many at TTF are particularly concerned about is the Financial Conduct Authority. They seem to be a hugely, supremely powerful body that seem to be acting in a way that demonstrates that there's not sufficient accountability and scrutiny of its activities. And perhaps one of the reasons is that they very proudly present their credentials as being independent from government. But perhaps they have too much independence and are causing or are responsible for huge harms to consumers. A lot of us think that consumers are getting a very rough deal under the FCA because their strategic objective, which seems to steamroller over absolutely everything else, is making sure that the markets are working well. And everything else seems to be take very much sort of second and third place to those objectives. We're also concerned that the FCA is far too close to those that it regulates in the city, and it's very opaque how its relationship with the Treasury, for instance. Now, I've attempted to put a particular question in the chat. That question has been constructed by Peter Hall, and it's somewhat esoteric, but it's concerned with the FCA's legality in the way that it operates. And I wouldn't expect either of the speakers to try and answer the question, on this session, but perhaps I'll have to email it across because the question was actually too long to be accepted in the chat in one go in any event. But it would be interesting, perhaps, if you could comment generally on how you think that the most important or our only real regulator may or may not be departing from democratic processes because of the way that it was set up and the way that it's evolved, bearing in mind that we're in the second iteration of the original organisation, which was the FSA, which was sort of reinvented because it failed. And it seems very obvious to many people that the current Financial Conduct Authority hasn't actually done any better than the FCA. Being such an important and central regulator, it would be very interesting to hear your sort of views on the way that the FCA is being run at the moment, and whether indeed you think it's fulfilling its functions correctly.
I think it's fair to say, Nigel, that there's no reason to think that Robert, as you correctly say, Robert and Liz probably won't have sufficient, knowledge about the FCA to comment in any meaningful way about that. But I'm just putting a general note in the chat, which I think builds on your point, Nigel, that if you have an organisation, any organisation that has been given a lot of power without a correspondingly appropriate degree of scrutiny and accountability, almost inevitably, it seems to me, that power will lead it to become, or to take its power for granted and to become a bit kind of excessive with how it uses it. And inevitably, organisations like that, I think, sooner or later start to go off the rails and start to actually, start to actually become exploitative and abusive, because there's nothing to put them back in their place. There's a phrase that's come out of the post office scandal: reckless indifference. It was used by some of the barristers, I think, to describe the way that arm's length bodies are being given too much freedom to get on with it by the government. Complete lack of accountability, a complete lack of scrutiny. And that they almost justify that laissez-faire attitude, that let them get on with it attitude, by saying, well, they're independent, therefore we haven't got a right to interfere. Thanks, Nigel, for your point. It's very, very valuable. Robert, Liz, any kind of general commentary about what can happen if you get an organisation, as we would believe, like the FCA, that's got too much power and not enough scrutiny and accountability? Any general comments about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Andy, I can't offer anything specific really on the FCA, although I do think it's a obviously a very important case with such an important role in the economy. So my light's on the blink. A couple of things I did want to pick up on it. It's sort of thinking about it generally. I think there is an issue with financial regulation because of the complexity of the topic, which makes it something that where it's difficult to get the oversight and scrutiny. And I'm not sure how much that it has to be that way, or if it is just something that we're not investing in the right way or constructing the institutions in the right way, and it could be fixed. But it strikes me that that's part of the problem, and was part of the problem in the financial crisis too, around complexity as well as the sort of role in the economy. And then that gets compounded by the problem of the revolving door. And this is also something that that Nigel mentioned and that has come up already quite a lot. And this, obviously, too free, easy movement between regulatory roles and role in the organisations that you're regulating is a big problem. It's something that is really not solved at all well in the UK. And I think that's where quite a lot of the problem also comes from, and it compounds the complexity issue that you haven't necessarily got people who understand well enough what they're regulating, and then you've got people who also, as well as maybe as not being able to get at the complexity of it, are essentially compromised by thinking about their next job, or simply having been socialized into a certain set of norms in their past job. And it's a tricky issue to solve, because the market doesn't necessarily solve this problem, because of course there is certain parts of this sector which are paid much better than others, and so getting the good people into the regulatory institutions is not easy. But I think those are some of the kind of systemic problems that we've got to deal with there: sort of complexity, revolving door, and then the difficulty of getting good, honest regulators and being able to retain them in the sector.
Thank you very much, Liz. Robert.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't have any specifics on the FCA, but a few reflections. The first is that I think there are rich pickings in the dictionary on this issue of regulators and the role of regulators, because they've become so critical in the world of particularly of privatization and the contracting out of public services. So one of the terms alongside revolving door is the term regulatory capture, which describes the deliberate intent by those who are regulated to go out and get the regulator to do what they want. And of course they do that partly through the revolving door, partly through lobbying, partly through an approach which means it's too costly for the regulator to regulate them properly. So there are all sorts of techniques that are used. And I think we've now learned after sort of more or less 30 years of regulation not working in this country in all sorts of fields, whether it's financial services or water or telecoms or wherever it might be. I think we've learned that our current regulatory model is not really working properly. So I absolutely agree with Andy's earlier point that accountability is a critical part of this. And I would think that, you know, if I were trying to reinvent what we would do with regulation, of course we would have regulators. I think we would want them to have people who are scrutinizing the regulators in a much more formal way. That one of the problems, I think, is that the people who have tended to be scrutineers of regulators are people who have been victims of the regulators making bad decisions. And they're not really good independent scrutineers of the regulators. They appear compromised. So what you really need is groups who are existing for their own sake to scrutinize regulators, not because they're the victims of a regulator having acted poorly or badly or ineffectively. That model doesn't really exist at the moment, partly for the reason that Liz was saying. You've got to be a real expert in financial services in order to scrutinize properly somebody like the FCA. I remember when I was at Transparency International, we started doing some work on money laundering. And in the first 2 or 3 years, the banks ran rings around us because they were so much more sophisticated in their language and their knowledge of the markets. I mean, I, you know, of course, had come to TI having worked in the city, but even so, you know, you're taking on the, you know, the top people in banks. They're just going to run rings around you unless you're on a level of information and knowledge that matches them. So the sophisticated NGOs now on money laundering have got to that stage, but it's taken probably 15 years. So I think we need scrutineers of that quality scrutinizing all our important regulators. Otherwise, you know, what we see in the regulatory capture, the sort of the regulatory intimidation by those who are meant to who they're meant to regulate would just carry on.
This is such a rich conversation. Well, there's I think I mentioned just before the session started, we had a march a few weeks ago in London, Robert and Liz, and it was called the Enough is Enough March for Justice, basically because everyone's fed up with the lack of justice. So we had a march in London. It was quite cool, and we started off at the Royal Courts of Justice, and then we walked to we walked down the Strand, and we stopped at several places. The Treasury, HMRC, Downing Street, New Scotland Yard. Outside the Treasury, I remember making reference to a Harold Wilson quote. The quote was, whichever party is in power, remember it's always the Treasury that's in charge. And it was a great quote. And we think that's really significant because we genuinely do think that the Treasury is an almighty powerful organisation that's surrounded in secrecy and opacity, and it's got its powers on the levers of all kinds of things, including, of course, the regulatory framework. And going back to that Andy Verity book I mentioned earlier, Rigged, a lot of that is effectively about how the Treasury looked after the city and allowed innocent people to be sent to jail. It's really quite awful what happened. Stephen Barker. Stephen's been thinking quite a bit about the Treasury recently, haven't you, Stephen? Stephen, why don't you share your thought? Thank you very much indeed.
Well, I just wanted to make two observations, really, in terms of a case study and the changing culture. And the two things are linked, quite frankly. And the case study would be the corruption scandals in the early 1970s of public procurement of housing. And at the centre of that, and most noted, was T. Dan Smith from Newcastle City Council, the city architect from Birmingham, and the private sector architect was Poulsen. And the point about that was it shook local government. And I was in local government at the time, a young person of no significance whatsoever, and completely confused. But the people I was working with and surrounded by in my local authority, the culture there was this is appalling. Nobody should be doing this. And we hope they go to jail for a long, long time, because we are all affected by it. What they do reflects on us. So that becomes the culture of that particular organisation, the one I was in. But clearly at Birmingham and in Newcastle, it was an entirely different culture. And we didn't have regulators. They're not invented as a species. It suddenly, though, became very effective because they appointed an unknown barrister called George Carman. Unknown in the sense he came from Blackpool, he was in a set in Manchester, he was a young criminal barrister, never done anything of any particular note, and he was not the character he later became that people now know. But at the time, he went where others would fear to tread, because as far as he was concerned, he'd nothing to lose. And he took the various police authorities with him, and they worked on particular cases in their area without any difficulty at all. And they found the evidence and they tracked the people down. And they also knew, a lot of them, what was going on in these councils. And they were prosecuted. And they didn't wait until they had a complete picture of the United Kingdom. They didn't have inquiries, review boards, all the sorts of things we have seen with the FCA, with the NHS. They didn't have any of that. They just found the evidence to prosecute, and they then prosecuted. And when they did that and people went to jail, as they did, suddenly the culture within the rest of local government became, shall we say, corrected. The difficulty we have today is that even where the whistleblowers, which by the way are very unprotected, but you need them for a healthy culture, you need people who are prepared to speak out. When they speak out, they're just hunted down by their employers. And I mean hunted down. They find themselves at the end of investigations themselves, enormous legal bills from their employer as they challenge them at employment tribunals. And nobody is listening to the fundamental complaint or information that the whistleblower is giving, because the organizations involved are all seeking to protect their perception of their culture, which they think is beyond criticism. So you've got to do something about whistleblowers in order to protect culture. So as a case study, there's two comparisons, if you like. There's the comparison between how we dealt with corruption in local government, which, by the way, went as far as Reginald Morley and a hospital in Gozo. I mean, it was a big corruption scandal at the time. But it didn't stop the police. They were happy to investigate Reginald Morley, and it caused the government all sorts of problems, as you would imagine. We need to get back, if I may say, to that sort of situation where the culture of certain organizations has just got to be above any criticism whatsoever. And the only way to do that is to drive out from within that organization those who would seek to run it very differently. And we've got plenty of examples of the organizations that, shall we say, run for their own benefit, run for their regulated client group, and they're not run for the benefit of the public at all. So I'd just say that on culture and case study. Thank you.
Stephen, that was very, very powerful. And obviously, I'll invite Liz and Robert to comment on what you've said in just a moment. An idea has just popped into my head, and this is completely like random. It would be fantastic if any of your students in Sussex wanted to explore the good case study examples for corruption and things like corruption in the financial services space. We can populate it with all kinds of ideas. Please take that idea away, Liz and Robert, because we'd love to have conversations with eager students who want to dig around some of the things that we think are corruption. Maybe they could apply your corruption pyramid to test whether in reality it is corruption, or perhaps we're just being conspiracy theorists, nut jobs, so to speak. Liz, Robert, any comments in relation to what Stephen just said?
Well, I can pick up on a few things. First, to say that actually one of the first reports that Robert and I worked on together was around corruption risks in local government. It was a report for Transparency International that came out in about 2013, I think, and it was called The Mounting Risks. And in that, I think we had three particular areas that we looked at, which were public procurement, social housing, and what's the other one? Planning, Robert? Can't remember now. But a key sort of point that we made in that was a big problem was the abolition of the Audit Commission, which had in fact been doing really good work, I think, in terms of scrutinising what was going on, being able to do these public interest reports on particular big issues, but also in kind of setting and maintaining standards across the board with local government through a lot of the scorecards and things that they were doing constantly, sort of just little things that ratcheted up the standards all the time. So I think, I would be right in saying that we both think that is a huge loss in the UK. And the crazy system that we have now of councils appointing their own auditors and then being potentially conflicted is no kind of adequate replacement for that. So I think that is a big risk now that allows a lot of things to happen. And then just to pick up sort of a couple of other things that really resonated with me, when you talked about the police being involved and being happy to go and investigate and bring prosecutions, it's puzzling why the police are so little involved in cases of misconduct in public office now. I mean, it might be that they just don't have the resources, or it's too political, but this is certainly something that is really lacking. And finally, your point about whistleblowers, absolutely true. I find it a really depressing topic to teach about, because when I teach about it, I have to tell the students that whistleblowers almost always lose out hugely personally. It's an immense personal cost involved in blowing the whistle, and also very infrequent that it leads to any positive outcome, actually. So although we would see whistleblowers as absolutely key to uncovering corruption, it's a very hard thing to do, and yeah, unfortunately they're not well enough protected, and there is not a culture of taking notice of them and correcting things, I think.
What I'm about to say is going to sound so insane, it must be untrue, okay? But I will say it. The single worst example of the egregious treatment of a whistleblower is one of the libel scandal victims who, and it's documented in the book that I mentioned earlier, who blew the whistle on malpractice in the libel scandal area. And believe it or not, over a period of about 18 months, his situation was exploited, manipulated, abused, and he himself ended up going to prison. Literally, he was the person saying to a bank, I'm not going to bother mentioning the name, there's something wrong here. And they twisted things such that he personally ended up going to jail. And if you don't believe me, read the book. It's awful. Thanks, Liz, for those comments. Robert, anything to add?
Yes, I mean, partly to agree furiously with what both Stephen and Liz have said, that, I think ultimately in institutions, this is really a question of leadership and the tone from the top.
Yeah.
And you can have, whatever systems and processes and compliance you want in place, none of them will work if the people at the top aren't really serious about it. And I noticed somebody had put early on in the chat a reference to the Nolan principles, the 7 standards of public life. Of course, we saw immediately what happened when we had a prime minister who entirely ignored those principles and seemed to sort of delight in ignoring those principles. that that seemed to infect so much else in politics in the country, and so on. You know, would the COVID PPE procurement VIP fast-lane stuff had happened under Theresa May, who I think, you know, was supportive of the principles of the Nolan principles, I suspect, you know, less likely. So I think that leadership is absolutely critical institutionally, and, you know, certainly in our politics as well. By the way, there are dictionary entries on the Nolan principles and whistleblowing, a really good one on whistleblowing. So I'd have a look at that. On the penalties side, again, there's an entry on rational choice theory, which is worthwhile having a look at. And that looks at, you know, what in the private sector you might call risk reward, for example, which is looking at, you know, are people less likely to commit crimes if the penalties are higher and are better enforced? And it seems to me that, you know, in lots of the area of corruption where it's breaking the law, that is the case, that we've seen it with the Bribery Act, for example, that when there has been good enforcement of anti-bribery legislation in the US and the UK, then companies have really rowed back on their activities. And when that's relaxed, when the enforcement is relaxed, then you find that there's a propensity for companies to revert to those business as usual practices. Just finally on the local government, I quite agree about those seminal cases, the T. Dan Smith and Paulson, so on. They're a chapter of my book on Corrupted Kingdom, to sort of set the scene for what the UK is today. But an interesting parallel, I think, is what's happening in the Tees Valley at the moment, in the Freeport in Tees. I don't know if any of you read Private Eye, but they've for a long time gone on about you know, these suspicious things happening around the sale of the land in the Tees Valley Development Corporation. And we just don't know enough yet to know whether this is simply incompetence, or whether it is corruption, or whether it's both. But that seems to me exactly the kind of role the Audit Commission would have played in the past. And at the moment, there is simply no public sector body whose job it is to look at whether corruption has occurred in the Tees Valley. And I think that's pretty much a hole in our armory in the UK's anti-corruption defences.
There's a phrase I've heard about recently, weaponised incompetence. I don't think you've got anything in your dictionary about weaponised incompetence, but it speaks to the idea that sometimes an organisation or an individual, you know, performs really badly deliberately because they have an outcome in mind. Maybe it's weaponised incompetence up in Teesside, who knows? This is such a rich conversation. I know I'm a bit biased, but I put a note in the chat. I'm so glad I'm here. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, folks, before we bring this very, very rich conversation to a close. But please raise your hand, or digitally or literally, if you'd like to come in with any of your final thoughts before we ask Liz and Robert to share their final thoughts. Mr. John Haywood, please go for it. So take yourself off mute first. Thank you, John.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Well, I've been listening to this with particular interest, because it does go right to the heart of everything. I've sort of concluded, having been slightly scammed somewhat myself originally in the mid-2000s or whatever. One of the things that struck me a few years ago was maybe I'm being naive here, but nevertheless, I'm going to say it, you know. Would it be worth thinking of devising some kind of test for personal honor and integrity? Is it even possible? Question 2, can anyone be corrupt? Or to turn it around, is there anyone or kind of person, that is, who could not or cannot be corrupted? I mean, what is it, apart from obviously lots of zeros on the end, that allows people to disregard their, I don't know, maybe they've never had them. Maybe they don't even feel that they are corrupt. I seriously think some don't. But when you look at their effect on, that they definitely have on a substantial number of particularly the public, I don't know how they can sleep at night sometimes.
Yeah, well said, John. I think it's documented, John, that there's a particular type of criminal or a particular type of sociopath, whatever the right word is, I don't know, where they literally do not see themselves doing bad, even though they actually are. I think you're onto something there, John. I really
Cannot
do.
the AI interview robots start weeding them out then? I mean, what are the clues? Why was Paula Reynolds, appointed for whatever? I'm not accusing her specifically of being corrupt, but there's a whole list of names you could come up with. But it's not just the names; it's the whole principle of it all.
Yeah, that fundamental integrity thing. We ran an event in Boston about 4 years ago, John, and I was fascinated to meet a chap who talked to me about moral quotient. Everybody knows what IQ is. Most people know what EQ is. So intelligence quotient, emotional quotient. He talked about moral quotient, and he was basically running a recruitment company, recruiting for leaders of financial services firms. And he was a very intelligent and progressive guy. And what he'd worked out was the one of the key characteristics you want in somebody running a financial services firm is somebody with a high moral quotient. I don't know what the right definition was, but it would be along the lines of somebody who's very unlikely to be bribable or corruptible or respond to incentives to cut corners or take excessive risks. And what he said to me was, the reason it's so important is because if you're a major international bank, you want people running the organization who've got really high integrity, because they're the ones who aren't going to trash its reputation through doing silly things like interest rate hedging product mis-selling, for example. I think you're onto something there.
How do you find them? I mean, Margaret Thatcher, is that the last sort of PM of this country who really stood her ground?
Who knows? We'll go to Liz and Robert for comments about those points, but also any other final comments you have, Liz and Robert. It's been such a fascinating conversation. We've been really glad to hear what you've had to say. Let's go ladies first. So Liz, your comments and any final comments, then we go to Robert. Liz, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy, and thanks, John. I've got a couple of pieces of research I can tell you about, not by me, but by other people, that shed light on your questions there at the end. The first one is something that was done by Abigail Barr and Danila Serra, and they did an experiment with international students who were coming into Oxford. And in the experiment, they design a little bribery game, which is quite nice because it has 3 parties. It has, they put some of the students in the role of a public official, some of them in the role of a kind of a corrupter. And if the public official accepts the bribe that is offered by the corrupter, they do get a private benefit. So both of those parties get some private benefit, and that's actual money that they walk out of the experiment with. But also some other people in the group who are cast in the role of the public get less money. So essentially everyone is going to come out of this experimental situation with a sum of money. If you're a corrupter or the corruptee, then you've got the option to do a deal, in which case you profit, but the others, the public comes out worse off. So it's constructed in the same way as corruption in real life. Now, they did that experiment with a whole load of international students coming in, and they found, rather amusingly, given that we often complain a lot about the accuracy of the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, they found that the propensity to engage in corruption correlated very well with the score of the country that they were coming from. If they were coming from Nigeria, they were much more likely to engage in corruption in this game, and Nigeria does very poorly on the Corruption Perceptions Index, etc. They then did an experiment with a group of international students who had been in Oxford for a year. They had massively converged to a UK norm. So what this says to me is that actually corruption is quite situational. I'm not sure that it's necessarily, I think there's variation in how moral people are, but I think it's also very much about the situation you find yourself in, what the norm is in the environment that you're in. So that's the first piece of research that I think is interesting. The second piece is by Yuval Feldman, and he's got a book called The Law of Good People. And his quite depressing finding is that people who think that they are good people probably like all of us sitting on this call, are much more likely to justify their own bad behavior because they're so convinced that they're good people that they'll come up with reasons why, although we're breaching the norms or breaking the rules, we're doing it for a good reason, or we're not actually doing anything wrong. So that's a slightly depressing note to end on. But I think for me, the takeaway is that we need to create situations, cultures, environments in which it's easy for people not to be corrupt, because I suspect that actually most people can be go over to the dark side given the wrong circumstances.
Everybody has their price, as they say.
So fascinating. Thanks, Liz. Thank you very much indeed. To you, sir, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on the question, can anyone be corrupt? If you look back at our original definition, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that harms the public interest, the answer is that you can only be corrupt in that definition if you're holding entrusted power. So I think the really interesting question is who has power? Now, there is debate amongst corruption academics as to whether, as in the memorable quote by Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Is it the power that corrupts people? Or there's a school of thought led by Brian Klaas in his book Corruptible, which is that corrupt people are more attracted to power. So you have to be really careful about who you give power to. So I think that would be my first lesson, is be very careful who you put in positions of power. Now that comes to the second part of your question. Is there a test of some kind of personal integrity? I think a test is quite hard, but what you could have, and has been sort of advocated for by campaign groups around the world, is some kind of pledge. Something that you swear to when you get into a position of power. You say, I will abide by these Nolan principles, for example, and if I don't, then I accept there will be certain sanctions. I won't be allowed to hold public office again. Maybe I'll forfeit my pension rights. I won't get any kind of bonuses, all those sort of things. So I quite strongly favour this sort of, you sign up to the pledge of the Nolan principles, and if you're found to have breached it by some sensible process, then you can't hold public office, you don't get your public sector pension anymore. For example, I think it's extraordinary that people regularly speak of Boris Johnson returning as an MP and possibly Prime Minister. I think a Prime Minister who has lied to Parliament should be permanently ruled out of public office, shouldn't have his prime ministerial salary for the rest of his life, which he will get. Likewise, David Cameron and the Greensill affair, I'm astonished that he can return as our Foreign Secretary. Though he may be as a Foreign Secretary, I think he's been ruled out of entitlement to public office. So, I would finish by saying I think we've got to be really suspicious of people who hold any position of power and put sufficient accountability around that. But particularly, you've got to get them to sign up to things that you can then hold them accountable for, and there should be proper penalties if they breach those things.
Yeah. It's been such a wonderfully rich conversation, folks. I'm just going to close the session by referring to this quotation, which I refer to from time to time. And the reason I'm going to is because I genuinely believe that TTF and our community is made up of people with a profound sense of purpose and a profound sense of public duty. Many of our community, Liz and Robert, are whistleblowers. Many of people who wear the scars of the consequences of speaking out and trying to speak truth to power and trying to expose wrongdoing and trying to tell the truth. And many of our community, including many of the people here tonight, are people who have bravely stepped forward. They've stood up rather than stood by. And I just admire that. And all the time TTF can do what it can to create a home and a sense of community and a safe place for people like that, then I think we're living our purpose as best as we can. This, I think, is one of my favourite quotations of all time. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. I really do think there must have been something in the air in the US in the 60s and in other parts of the world where we were in this kind of phase of enlightenment and progressiveness, where people were looking to the future with hope and with a sense of honour, where people were unwilling to tolerate the status quo. And I genuinely think with sadness that we seem to be going in the other direction at the moment. And I truly hope there's going to be some kind of pendulum shift that's going to get us going back in the right direction. Maybe, folks, it's one of those situations where it's got to get worse before it suddenly gets better. Maybe there'll be some kind of paradigm shift in the future. There's a powerful quotation, Robert F. Kennedy. Every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt, because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. Liz and Robert, you've taught us things tonight that we didn't know. You've helped us understand things that we may have instinctively had a connection with, but you've helped us understand things better. And we are very, very grateful to you for doing that. And I think we're going to remember this session for a long time. I'm so glad we've recorded it. A lot of people in our community are going to want to watch it. And we'd love to have one or more of your students having a look at some of the stuff that we've got to see whether there might be, you know, that pyramid of corruption triangle could actually be assessed against some of the things we've been finding out about, that makes my toes curl and keeps me up at night and causes me and others to literally march the streets of London in protest. Liz, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Please show us our appreciation to our wonderful, wonderful speakers. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Robert. We're very, very grateful indeed. And on that note, we'll draw our conversation to close. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Robert. Good night, all. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
A huge
Good
pleasure.
night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, Robert. Good night, all. Sleep safe. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. And buy the book. Buy the book.